So Eddie Bernays had discovered the powerful connection between emotions and using basic products to reinforce or boost emotions and the idea of becoming fulfilled.
Eddie Bernays saw the way to sell product was not to sell it to your intellect, that you ought to buy an automobile, but that you will feel better about it if you have this automobile. I think he originated that idea, that they weren't just purchasing something, but they were engaging themselves emotionally or personally in the product or service. That it's not, you think you need a new piece of clothing, but you'll feel better with the piece of clothing. That was his contribution in a very real sense. We see it all over the place today, but I think he originated the idea of the emotional connect to a product or service.
His overwhelming success of the first campaign really created a huge buzz amongst Americans, industrialists and bankers. They had experienced how, as a result of the First World War, when industrial production had reached unparalleled output, that there were corresponding massive profits, and they wanted to find a way to keep the party going. And so there was a lot of discussion amongst the leaders of society at the time how to achieve that. And the conclusion was that there was a need, or there had to be a massive shift in the priorities of the common person.
What Bernays was doing fascinated America's corporations. They had come out of the war rich and powerful, but they had a growing worry. The system of mass production had flourished during the war, and now millions of goods were pouring off production lines. What they were frightened of was the danger of overproduction, that there would come a point when people had enough goods and would simply stop buying. Up until that point, the majority of products were still sold to the masses on the basis of need. While the rich had long been used to luxury goods, for the millions of working-class Americans, most products were still advertised as necessities. Goods like shoes, stockings, even cars were promoted in functional terms for their durability. The aim of the advertisements was simply to show people the product's practical virtues, nothing more. What the corporations realized they had to do was transform the way the majority of Americans thought about products. One leading Wall Street banker, Mazer of Leahman Brothers, was clear about what was necessary. We must shift America, he wrote, from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things even before the old have been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desires must overshadow his needs.
Prior to that time, there was no American consumer. There was the American worker, and there was the American owner, and they manufactured and they saved and they ate what they had to, and the people shopped for what they needed. And while the very rich may have bought things they didn't need, most people did not. And Mazer envisioned a break with that, where you would have things that you didn't actually need, but you wanted, as opposed to needed.
And the man who would be at the center of changing that mentality for the corporations was Edward Bernays.
Bernays really is the guy within the United States, more than anybody else, who sort of brings to the table psychological theory as something that is an essential part of how, from the corporate side, of how we are going to appeal to the masses effectively. And the whole sort of merchandising establishment and sales establishment is ready for Sigmund Freud. I mean, they are ready for understanding what motivates the human mind. And so that there's this real openness to Bernays' techniques being used to sell products to the masses.
So up until this time, people basically purchased goods because they needed them, and one of the main drivers of people's choice was the durability of a product. It simply had to look reasonably okay, it had to function properly, and it had to last. It was not until much later that the idea of a product life cycle or building in of redundancy into products was adopted. Bernays, however, introduced several powerful ideas to mainstream America and revolutionized how people bought products.
Beginning in the early 20s, the New York banks funded the creation of chains of department stores across America. They were to be the outlets for the mass-produced goods, and Bernays' job was to produce the new type of customer. Bernays began to create many of the techniques of mass consumer persuasion that we now live with. He was employed by William Randolph Hearst to promote his new women's magazines, and Bernays glamorized them by placing articles and advertisements that linked products made by others of his clients to famous film stars like Clara Bow, who was also his client. Bernays also began the practice of product placement in the movies, and he dressed the stars at the film's premieres with clothes and jewellery from other firms he represented. He was, he claimed, the first person to tell car companies they could sell cars as symbols of male sexuality. He employed psychologists to issue reports that said products were good for you, and then pretended they were independent studies. He organised fashion shows in the department stores and paid celebrities to repeat the new and essential message: you bought things not just for need, but to express your inner sense of yourself to others.
You'll see that a lot of things have been mentioned here. Product placements, putting them in movies so that people see them and consider them desirable then. The cross-promotion, where you've got different companies utilizing each other's platforms to cross-promote merchandise, things that have become now the staple of advertising and promotions, were actually introduced. They were invented and introduced by Bernays, who was decades ahead of his time. And his main motivation for doing all of this, as was previously stated, was that he saw it as a way to accumulate massive amounts of wealth. And he became an extremely wealthy individual who exerted this outsized influence on society.